my relationship with the East Antarctic Marine Protected Area, and indeed the other two that are up for negotiation, which is the Weddell Sea one and the Antarctic Peninsula one, if you want to look at it in those terms, stems from my long relationship with the Antarctic. I've been going there for 25 years, which when you put it in those terms is a long time. I've been 12 times, but many of the times I've been there have been for long duration expeditions with a bit of science thrown in. I did retrace the journey of Douglas Mawson a few years ago to sort of celebrate the great achievement of Mawson, who was a scientist foremost and really an explorer second, but also to test whether he needed to cannibalise the second guy who died in his arms in order to make the expedition that had all gone wrong possible. I travelled with an increasingly nervous Russian who was very pleased to discover it could indeed be done without the need to eat the other guy, so that was that bit of history. But look, my interest in Antarctica is at a whole series of different levels. I'm an environmental scientist. I am, as I say, the ambassador for WWF in this country, and I enjoy the remoteness of the Antarctic as a place that hasn't been subjugated by people. There's some of the cleanest, most pristine oceans in the world down there, even though microplastics have indeed made their way down to even those waters. Home to around 9,000 different species, the Antarctic waters. They really are this incredibly rich, biodiverse, rich habitat that we need to be very, very mindful of trying to protect. I think we've got two existential threats, and I don't want to go over the same ground as Lynn, but I think the first one is the degradation of ecosystems down there, and that can be everything from pollution in the water to physical catching of krill and things like Patagonian toothfish, which are very, very have a very long, slow breeding cycle. And the other one, of course, is climate change. In terms of the first one, many of the early explorers, as I say, when Antarctica was first discovered in 1820, it was really either the Brit Bransfield, the Russian Bellingshausen, or indeed Nathaniel Palmer, the American, who first sort of sighted it in 1820. And Palmer, of course, was a sealer. He was only there, wasn't interested in planting a flag. He was interested in harvesting the ocean for seals. And that relationship began with sealing in the early 1800s through to about the 1830s, when we completely exhausted the seal populations, through to whaling that occurred all the way up to around the 1920s, 1930s. These, interestingly, they're digesters on Macquarie Island. And when we ran out of seals and whales, we used to chuck penguins in those and render them down, light a fire underneath and render down the oil to get the subcutaneous fat that each penguin contained. And of course, the penguins now are blissfully unaware of this and sort of mill around these digesters, unaware that their forebears might have ended up in the pot. But look, Macquarie is a fascinating place, of course. It is now a wildlife sanctuary, and it was Douglas Mawson, in fact, in 1933 who got it designated as such. So Australia has a long and very proud tradition of conservation in Antarctica, which is why we have such an important role to play, all the way back from things like the work of Mawson, all the way through to Bob Hawke, who in fact is a South Australian, who said, we're not going to allow mining or defence-based activity in Antarctica. And it was actually him who was instrumental in ensuring the Antarctic Treaty didn't allow for mining or defence-based activity in Antarctica. Going over kind of what Lynn has said, I mean, the big fear today is not necessarily, certainly not seals anymore, we don't take them. Some whaling still occurs, but very limited amounts. I think the big fear is really krill, because krill are this little crustacean that form the basis of the food web, as was mentioned in the Pew film. I think the big worry, the figures I have, everybody's figures slightly differ as to what is being taken, but there's about 380 million tonnes of krill in the ocean. I think the catch at the moment is only several 100,000 tonnes, but that's the stuff we know about. The IUU, the illegal, unregulated and unreported krill harvest, could be many multiples higher than that official figure. And that's the thing that is really worrying for us. And as Lynn said before, krill are great sequesters of CO2 in addition to forming the basis of the food web. The other threat, which is really my bag, I'm really involved a lot in the climate science these days, is climate change. And I went down to Antarctica most recently in November through to January, down to the Antarctic Peninsula on the left-hand side there. And the temperatures there have risen 3.2 degrees Celsius in the last 60 years. In fact, I didn't have a single day below zero in the 2 months I was there, to give you some indication. You go further south in Antarctica, of course, it gets far colder. But in that part, the temperatures were not below freezing in the 2 months I was there, which is really pretty frightening. The eastern part of Antarctica is ironically a little bit colder due to the changes in SAM, the southern annular mode, which is the way the ocean circulation works. But that's kind of, I don't want to call it an anomaly, but suffice to say we have enough ice in the western part of Antarctica to raise sea levels on their own by 7 meters. So we're very concerned about the climate change happening there. And the scale, as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, is huge. Antarctica is twice the size of Australia, as I mentioned, but even icebergs and some of the ice shelves that are breaking off are vast. This is the remnants of B-15, which is the largest iceberg to break off Antarctica that I saw in 2006. When it first broke off, it was 295 kilometers long by 37 kilometers wide and several hundred meters thick. So this is a large piece of real estate. Poor old Singapore gets it in the neck again because it's 15 times the size of Singapore. Sorry about that, Singapore. But the scale of what we're dealing with down there is vast. Interestingly, krill, and this is one, sit at the absolute nexus of this issue. They are not only critical to the biodiversity of Antarctica and form the basis of the food web down there, but as Lynn mentioned, they are great sequesters of CO2. When they either die or excrete waste matter, it goes down to the deep ocean where that carbon is essentially locked up. And the figures I have that I often cite are that krill on a daily basis sequester the same amount of CO2 as the UK produces through all its industry and energy generation. So they really are major sequesters of CO2. So they're important for two very fundamental reasons. CCAMLR, Lynn has given us a very exhaustive rundown, so I don't propose to, but I'm not happy with it. Set up in 1982. As part of Australia's proud tradition, it's hosted here. So in fact, it's the only international environment convention that we host. It's becoming a bit of a glorified fishing treaty, really, where the catch limits are set very low to get conservation outcomes. So its conservation teeth are not really sharp enough. They're too slow, and they are consensus-driven. And guess what? 2 of the members are Russia and China. So it doesn't matter how much we all go around patting ourselves on the back about progress being made amongst the rest of the world. If you can't get those 2 countries over the line with all of their vested interests in politics, then you're going to go nowhere. So we need to really rethink about how we get outcomes that don't involve this very clumsy, frankly fairly tiresome consensus-based approach to it. So there are many things that I'm unhappy about. It does get some good outcomes. Many of the people involved are very highly credible diplomats and politicians. There's a lot of goodwill, but we're just not getting the outcomes fast enough. In terms of the outcomes we have got, as Lynn mentioned, there's 2 red ticks on this map. You can see they're the 2 MPAs that we have got over the line. The South Orkneys is the one at the top there. That's 94,000 square kilometres, I believe, and the Ross Sea is about 1.5 million square kilometres. The stuff that's not on that map are the ones that individual countries have basically got over the line. They include South Georgia from the Brits, Prince Edward Island, which is sort of south of South Africa, that's run by the South Africans, Kerguelen Island and its marine protected area, which is the French, and Heard and MacDonald, which is down to us. But when you add those 4 countries' MPAs plus the 2 that we've collectively got over the line, which is Ross and the South Orkneys at the top, we've only got 13% of the 35 million square kilometres that form the remit of CCAMLR over the line. If you take out the ones that the individual countries have done, we've only actually agreed on 5% protection, and yet we all agreed we protect the whole lot. So we're really kind of dragging our heels. In terms of my involvement, it's been related to helping Pew, whose video you saw at the beginning of Lynn's presentation, try and lobby to get the East Antarctic Marine Protected Area over the line. It would be the second biggest after the Ross, about 1 million square kilometres, and it's now broken up into 3 areas: Dragalski, D'Urville and Mac Robertson. It was formerly one continuous zone, but it's been a little bit watered down. But nevertheless, if we can get that over the line, it will be absolutely huge. You know, I lobbied very successfully and found a very receptive audience in Maurice Payne and Susan Lee, who were the Foreign Minister and Environment Minister respectively in the former government, and they were highly supportive. Australia and 23 other members of CAMLAR are highly supportive. The difficulty, of course, on the international scale is you need consensus, and that involves also getting China and Russia over the line. Do we need to defer to a different authority other than CAMLAR, or strengthen CAMLAR in order to enable it to find a way to politically navigate these waters to get Russia and China to engage, rather than through the mechanics of CAMLAR? That's the big question. That's the big question. Thank you.